The simple answer is well, there are these five countries. But more than that, the BRICS are also a symbol of a changing world.
More on that in just a moment. From Asia News Weekly, you're listening to Asia Now, a collection of stories and interviews from the Asia Pacific region. Asia has some of the world's biggest economies. The region is also home to several so-called developing nations. Will a new development bank grounded in Asia make a difference? It's one conversation taking place in Asia now. Welcome to Asia Now. I'm Steve Miller. It's often said that money makes the world go round. But how does a developing nation get the capital it needs to transition into first world status? Returning to today's show is Curtis S. Chin, the inaugural Asia Fellow of the Milken Institute. Well, Curtis, welcome back to the show.
Oh, great. It's always great to be back.
So I have a question for you. In recent news, this whole notion of the BRICS Bank has really received a lot of attention. So for a lot of our listeners, we know exactly what is going on in terms of the geopolitical things in the region, but not so much on the economic front. So if you could, please really briefly explain what is BRICS and why was it formed and what role does it serve?
Sure. A great question. There have indeed been a lot of headlines and stories about the BRICS. But, let's take a step back, way back to, let's say, I think it was around 2001. There's an economist at Goldman Sachs. His name is Jim O'Neill. And he put out a paper that was called something like Building Better Global Economic BRICS. And here, BRICS was, again, a wordplay, of course, on, use bricks to build a building. But this is really an acronym, a big B, big R, big I, and big C initially. And those letters stand for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And these four countries were seen as really the nations that would really drive the global economy going forward. For so long, it's been all about, what we refer to as the West, but, we'd also throw in places like Japan in there, but really the developed economies as driving global growth. So Jim O'Neill, in his paper, really, I don't know if he created it, but he certainly popularized this notion of the BRIC, this acronym. But it's also, not just about these four countries. If you read his paper, which I encourage people to do, it really talked about what he saw as a shift of a global economic power. So from the old days of, whether it's the G8, the G7, or, now G20.
The G20?
Yeah, this grouping of big countries that really, if you add them all up, account for most of the global economy. Jim O'Neill back then was arguing, well, let's pay attention to these four nations, and how right he was. So now come to today, 13, 14 years since that 2001 paper. And these four nations have really captured people's imaginations. But in addition to that original four, the BRIC, people have added an S, a capital letter S, for South Africa. And I guess that also reflects how the world is indeed changing. And just as how South America, Asia have grown, people are saying Africa too will grow. And certainly the dominant economy, when you add it all up in South Africa, sub-Saharan South Africa at least, is South Africa. So to your question, so what are the BRICS? Of course, the simple answer is, well, there are these five countries. But more than that, the BRICS are also a symbol of a changing world. And I've long argued, I write regularly for the Wall Street Journal and other papers and speak regularly. And I say, yeah, let's indeed pay attention to these five countries, but let's also think about how the overall world is changing. And so when we think about the BRICS, what is it that they're now doing? So one thing they do is they actually meet regularly. There's a BRICS summit. And so recently at the most recent BRICS summit, which took place in Brazil, around the time of the World Cup, in fact, these nations moved forward towards the establishment of what we call the BRICS Bank, but others call a new development bank. And so what are development banks? These are multilateral or owned by government institutions that also help countries and governments. So it's not like you or I can go to the World Bank or where I used to be on the board of directors, the Asian Development Bank, and get a loan. But as countries, These institutions were created to assist countries, so countries can go to them and get some assistance. So the BRICS have created or announced the creation of what will be their own development bank, and that's the BRICS Bank. And that also goes to the heart of your question. What is the BRICS Bank? The simple answer is that these five nations have come together, pledged to put in, I think it's something like $10 billion each in capital to create a bank that would, like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank and the African Development Bank, provide loans to countries to help them move forward, to help build their infrastructure. And so I don't know if that was a short answer, but that's certainly an answer to what is the BRICS Bank. But I think another answer might also be the BRICS Bank is, again, a sign of a changing world, which I think all of the world should embrace. Let's not be afraid of Brazil, Russia, India, China, or South Africa's rise. Certainly, I think as an American, as an Asian American in Asia looking at an increasingly assertive China, I would certainly hope that the BRICS behave in maybe ways different than they're now behaving. But let's not be afraid of their seeking to create institutions that hopefully will also help them develop and develop in a way that will benefit everyone around them.
Well, let's continue that. I mean, you've mentioned the Asian Development Bank, International Monetary Fund, the African Development Bank. Are we seeing too many development banks in the region?
I wouldn't evaluate such banks by their numbers, but I think it's a very fair question to ask. Are they overlapping? Are we wasting money by kind of repeating something that someone else is already doing? That being said, I'd say in the world of development banks, I wrote a piece for Fortune magazine that argued that in the world of these multilateral institutions, we can benefit from competition. And I hope that is what happens, that this new development bank, and China has actually proposed another one, an Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. My hope is that all of these kind of entities won't race to the bottom to lend more money to people, but instead will compete in developing better ways to assist countries and to assist the people we're really trying to help, which are often the poorest people in the least developed nations. But, these banks that exist, certainly provide some incremental value. But I always say the reality is that the solution to the fight against poverty, the solution in terms of how is it that we can create more jobs, isn't more institutions like this. They will help on the margins. I believe the real solution to economic growth and the challenge of creating jobs is in allowing the private sector to succeed, to free up the private sector and to free up people, to create businesses, to invest in their own companies or other companies. And so when we always talk about the BRICS, what I call the capital letter BRICS, I say to people, I worry more about the little brick.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. You've mentioned this before, the little bricks, the pieces that actually do the work.
Yeah, it's in some ways, I don't know if it's pieces that do the work, but I see the little brick as a constraint even to the big brick. And so let me define that for you. So we talked about the big brick. Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and now South Africa making the BRICS. Whenever I visit, regions, whenever I visit countries, people ask me, who will be the next BRIC? Who will be that next country like the Brazil or Russia, India, China, or South Africa that will capture people's imaginations, that will represent kind of a new center of growth? And clearly you can make a case for many countries. And I think there's so many acronyms out there where people are adding up the first letters of many countries, whether it's Mexico, Indonesia, or Turkey. And so I don't want to play that game. What I want to say to people is that every country indeed can be a member of the big brick. But what they have to first do is address the little brick. And that's not a country that is bureaucracy, that is regulation, that is interventionism by government, that is corruption. And when South Africa came along and I thought I needed to add a little s to my little brick, it's also sectarianism. So these five things, bureaucracy, regulation, interventionism, corruption, and now sectarianism, these I believe are the real economic constraints to growth. And I think we'd be better off if we all, as individuals or as countries, focused on how do we find the right balance in each of these areas? How do we address these five things versus focusing on, let's just promote my nation as the next brick. And so when you look at each of these areas, sometimes it's a matter of balance. Clearly we need bureaucrats. Clearly we'll always have some form of bureaucracy. And government can be of value, but when does it get out of hand? When are the bureaucrats out of control? Related to that is regulation. Clearly we do need some regulation, kind of, make sure that private companies and others are appropriately, behaving. but heavily gone overboard in some countries with too much regulation. And certainly, this is the debate now taking place in India under its new Prime Minister Modi. So, bureaucracy, regulation, interventionism. Of course, I come from a viewpoint where I'd rather have the government intervene less in an economy than more. Much for debate. And again, there's no right answer in all of these areas. It's a matter of balance. So when has a government intervened too much in the economy, which is then a disincentive for businesses to be involved if they feel the rules may change all of a sudden with a government intervention that they had not noticed. For my fourth little letter, the C for corruption, I would argue that there is no balance. We really should not have any corruption in society, in government, but we also have to think about the reality of what can be done in the near term to change things. And then when I added my little S, sectarianism, to my little brick, in some ways that idea was driven by what I've seen and experienced in Asia these last 3 or 4 years. I mean, we need only look to Myanmar, Burma, and to see how sectarianism has raised its head again, particularly with regards to the Rohingya. That's a name of the Muslim population there in mainly in Rakhine State, but there the government doesn't even recognize that name of the Rohingya people. But we need not just focus on Myanmar or Burma. I think we see across the world sectarianism on the rise, whether it's in Iraq or whether it's in southern Philippines, in Mindanao, a place I go to quite frequently. So all these things, this 5 economic constraints to growth, this little bricks, I would say, is what we also need to focus on, in addition to all that we might do to help the BRICS and this new BRICS Bank succeed.
Let's turn our attention back to China for just a moment. It's a huge economic power in the world. Do you think that its inclusion in the BRICS makes it a little bit more, have the ability to carry more weight? It's an unbalanced relationship.
I wouldn't say unbalanced. I mean, first we got to look at each of these new institutions. So specifically, the BRICS have created, or in the process of creating, a new development bank. That's what we're referring to right now as the BRICS Bank. And with all these things, there's a long negotiation before they actually happen. So in this case, I think the bank is actually authorized by the BRICS nations to have up to $100 billion in capital. These 5 nations have each pledged right now $10 billion each. So in a sense, they're all kind of equal. But the reality is that there are other negotiations that take place behind the scenes. And so what have the results been? One result has been this new development bank will be based in Shanghai. The first head of that BRICS Bank will be chosen by India. So Russia and Brazil will also have very senior officials at that institution. And in South Africa, they'll create a little bit of, I won't say a parallel organization, but they'll also create a related institution that focuses on development in Africa. So each of these countries are negotiating for something that will, of course, benefit their own citizens. My fear is always that all this at some point turns into less of a focus on why these institutions are created, which are to drive economic development, to help fight poverty. And instead, it becomes a big behind-the-scenes battle over perks and prerogatives and appointments. And so that's my fear there. And certainly, if you put in the most money, you're probably going to have more influence. And so I think I even saw that at the Asian Development Bank, where I sat on the board of directors for nearly 4 years. I had the honor really to serve in a bipartisan capacity, nearly 2 years under President Obama and nearly 2 years under President Bush. And there, of course, I'm focused on trying to drive good governance, greater transparency in my role as a board director. But I'm also there representing the United States, trying to advance U.S. concerns, advance U.S. interests and address U.S. concerns. But they don't always jive with some of the views of other countries. But clearly people are going to pay attention, perhaps more so to what I say. And it's certainly not because it's me, but it's because I'm representing one of the 2 largest shareholders at that bank, which are, of course, Japan and the United States. So I think we'll see this play out at all institutions. While everyone, in theory, might be seen as equal when it comes to diplomacy, the reality, based on how much money you put in, how much influence comes from that money, will also shape your influence at the overall organization. So I think that's very much the reality of any of these international bodies.
All right, Curtis, thank you very much for your time today.
No, my pleasure. It's always great to be talking with you and sharing views on how Asia is ever changing. I say to people that people, of course, see Asia in the headlines. They hear about Asia on these podcasts. But let's dive deeper and realize that Asia is not just China or India. It's so much richer. It's so much more. And so I welcome these chances to share a view or two. Thank you.
Again, a huge thank you to Curtis Chin, the inaugural Asia Fellow of the Milken Institute, for joining me this week. Now, before I go, I do have a question for you, and that is this. Do you believe China will attempt to wield its influence to steer the direction of the BRICS in order to suit its needs? Please share your thoughts on this story in the comments to keep this conversation going. Don't forget, you can also connect with us on Facebook and Twitter. Just look for Asia News Weekly on either of those two social media sites. And you can also send an email to the show if you have any questions or feedback. Just drop a line to asianewsweekly@gmail.com. You can also play and download all of our shows from our website and SoundCloud. But if you do prefer the podcast version of the show, you can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, and TuneIn Radio. And if you really did enjoy this episode, please, I hope you'll take a moment and share it with your friends and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Next week is the Chuseok holiday in South Korea, meaning that I get a full week off and I'll be on vacation. So Asia Now will return in 2 weeks' time, so I'll talk to you then. Thank you very much for listening today. For Asia Now, I'm Steve Miller. Asia Now is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.